A few years ago, my best friend went missing. He was a good man, a kind soul kind of guy who would give his only food to someone on the street who needed it more, even if it meant he would go hungry. The guy's name was Brian. Brian really loved hunting and said he'd be out for a week or two to get some delicious future deer sausage, as he liked to put it. The man was a saint, and so when he was a few days late from the trip, we all got concerned. When it hit a week, we dropped everything and went looking for him ourselves. For the record, we reported Brian missing a few days prior. The group on this search was myself and 3 of my buddies, who we'll call Charlie, Jake, and Donovan. I won't use my name, but you can call me Jack. Before we go any further, I should mention we live in Mississippi. Small details out of the way. Let's get on with the story. The first day or night, rather, that we went on a search, we arrived late and set up our campsite. The night was cold. It was November, almost December, of an unseasonable cold fall. We were tired. We knew we wouldn't be able to do much searching at that moment, and so we decided to sleep so we could get up bright and early and truly begin the search. We slept for a time, but at about 3 o'clock in the morning, I heard a completely strange sound. I'm not even sure how to describe it, but it woke me up out of a dead sleep. It was loud, that much I can't say. Loud enough to rile up most of the camp and have us looking out of our tents. Donovan was the only one who was still sleeping, but that guy could sleep through literally the end of the world. Anyway, those of us who were awake lightly whispered to what it could be before deciding to get up and listen for a few minutes more. When we heard nothing, we figured we'd try to get another hour or so shut-eye. Going back into our tents, we slept. The alarms went off at 5 o'clock in the morning. We immediately took some provisions and our rifles and headed out into the woods in search of Brian. There wasn't much chatter in the morning. As the sun crested the hills, the woods were cold. We had a mission, and we were intent on completing that mission. The woods were also quiet. It's something I didn't really know at the time, but I probably should have. As we searched in silence, we came upon an orange beanie. Now, it could have been anyone's, but it was the right size and looked an awful lot like the warm Brian would have worn. The thing had what looked like blood on it. This was an unnerving find, to say the least, but we weren't about to make assumptions, and perhaps all of us wanted to think and believe that Brian was still okay. We continued our trek through the afternoon, and it was then we found something very off, and something that was no mistaking as Brian's. His truck had been abandoned in the middle of the woods. This was exceedingly odd, as he wouldn't have driven his truck into the woods at all under normal circumstances. Stranger still was the fact that it was wrecked pretty badly. There were no signs of blood, but there were huge claw marks etched into the sides of the wreckage. It was at this point we began to fear the worst. We weren't about to give up on our friend, but the evidence before us presented horrifying possibilities. That said, it also presented completely confusing possibilities. What could make such deep and large claw marks into the side of the truck? The marks were massive, like a bear, but if it were a bear, it would need to be huge. We searched the truck and realized Brian's weapons weren't in it. This gave us some hope that maybe he was still out there and still okay. This, combined with the fact that there didn't appear to be any blood at the scene, gave us all the hope we needed to press onward. We continued our search well into the evening before deciding we needed to head back for the night. We also decided to pick things up earlier the next day so we could cover more ground. We packed up our camp and set out, planning to make better headway on future days, as the first day was only planned to be a preliminary search of sorts, and wasn't meant to be as extensive as it wound up being. So we returned to camp and slept. There were no strange noises on this night, and we awoke at 4:30 in the morning and ate before packing up our things and heading back in the direction we found Brian's truck. It didn't take us long, as we had a real direction to head in this time, and we weren't aimlessly searching. We looked over Brian's truck one last time, and having found nothing new of interest, we headed further into the woods. As we continued our search of the woods, they once again were silenced. This was something we actually noticed this time, and Charlie even remarked on it. He asked if we'd noticed how quiet it was, and we all agreed it was rather strange. I didn't say anything at the time, at least to me. It also felt as though someone was watching us. We had weapons, though, and we didn't exactly scare easily. Also, we had a decent group with there being 4 of us, so I didn't bring up the feeling at all as it didn't seem to bother anybody else, and I didn't want to warrant any, nauseating thoughts. By the time the sun was ready to set, we hadn't found anything new. It seemed like the trail to Brian had gone cold. It also seemed as though he'd simply vanished altogether. This was disappointing, and when the next couple of days turned up nothing as well, we were beginning to grow frustrated. The 4th night of searching ended in a cold wind, rain, a general feeling of disdain, as well as discouragement. It was on the 4th night we agreed we'd search at least 3 more days before presenting what we found to the authorities and hoping for the best. Keep in mind we had jobs, lives, families, and we weren't off heading back on weekends to continue the search. On the morning of the 5th day, it was still raining. We packed up our gear, got into some more weather-appropriate clothing, and continued our search. By noon, we had found nothing. We were frustrated, but we pressed on. By around 4 o'clock, we came upon tracks in the mud. They looked like a bear, but much, much larger. It reminded us of Brian's truck, at least in the size of the markings. But another thing worried us as well. These tracks were in the mud, and they were fairly fresh. They led over a hill, and it was there where we were shocked to find Brian. He was bloodied, had some marks we couldn't quite recognize, but he looked cold and terrified. We set up camp and got him out of the rain. We tried to give him food, but he said he wasn't hungry. After a short while, we all turned in. Brian stayed in Charlie's tent, and we all dozed off. It was about 1 o'clock in the morning when we woke up to the terrified cries of Charlie. We got up, grabbed our weapons, and ran to his tent in time to see him being dragged out by something huge in the darkness. Worried for Charlie, we continued our pursuit of him and whatever had him. The screams coming from Charlie were horrifying, but even more horrifying was the massive size of whatever was dragging him away. Add to the fact that it had unnatural speed, and you can understand how confused and fearful we were. At the time, we chased as far as we could, but this thing was fast. About a half hour into the chase, we were gassed. We paused to breathe, and that's when we heard Brian's voice screeching in the distance. We got all the energy we could muster up and ran up the hill to catch up with him. Exhausted, we found Brian shaking, cold and stammering, while pointing a shaky finger at a horrific sight. It was Charlie. He had been torn open. It was clear he was dead. We were all sick at the sight of our friend laying dead, having been dragged away and mauled in the night by something we still couldn't identify. We tried our best to calm Brian and warm him up in the rain. When we got him back to camp, we tried to ask him what happened, but he just looked catatonic. He was clearly lost in his mind and shaken by whatever he had witnessed. We slept in shifts the remainder of the night, although if I'm being honest, none of us really slept. The next morning we all had some coffee except Brian, who said he didn't want anything, increasing his anxiety at the moment. After the previous night's events, I understood, and so we didn't press him on, but we did ask him again what he witnessed. Shakily, he explained how he heard Charlie's screams and then saw this massive shadow drag him off. He gave chase immediately, but the thing was fast, and by the time Charlie made it, well, at that point, he trailed off and stopped speaking. I certainly understood why he would have, dropped the subject. The next thing that came up was what to do next. After some chat, we decided it was time to go to the police. And then at home, we were all tired from the search, traumatized by what had happened to Charlie, and we certainly didn't feel safe spending another night in the woods. We quickly packed up and began to head back. It was noon when Brian said he needed to pee. We told him we'd hang back, but he insisted he should at least go up the hill so he had some privacy. We did so, but we didn't stray far. It was when we came over the hill that her blood ran cold. Hanging from a tree, splayed all over and heart missing, was the torn and tattered body of my best friend Brian. Before we could even question how this was possible, a dread-induced, cold, mocking laughter came from behind us. It started in Brian's voice, but soon became a guttural, nonsensical roar of sorts. Turning around, we saw a creature I can only describe as a massive bear, but honestly, I'm not even sure if it was even a bear at all. Fearful for our lives, we pulled our rifles off our shoulders and emptied everything we had into this thing. A few of those bullets were placed between the eyes of this thing, and yet it seemed unfazed. Not only was it unfazed, but it appeared to be smiling at us. Its teeth were massive, and fearing being eaten alive by them, we all ran for it. We were terribly far from the wood's entrance at this point, but we'd already seen how fast this monstrosity could move, and we knew we were basically running on prayers. Donovan, myself, and Jake ran as fast as we could, probably faster than any of us had ever run in our lives. But as we ran, we heard this thing begin to pursue us, and in what seemed like a near blink of an eye, it was on top of Jake, and he was screaming. We stopped and tried to go back for him, but it was too late. This thing was eating his insides in seconds. It was eating almost as quickly as it moved, and it was at this point that Donovan and I left. We couldn't do anything for Jake, and while you can label us as cowards if you wish, there was again nothing we could do. We ran and prayed, and yet we reached the entrance with Jake's screams still in our minds. We were no longer pursued by whatever had killed our friends. We got in our truck and went straight to the police and did our best to explain the situation. As you might imagine, we weren't taken very seriously. A search was done for the bodies, and if they were never recovered, whatever this thing was probably ate the bones or did a damn great job of covering its tracks. Brian's truck wasn't even around anymore. Distraught and horrified, the search was given up after a time. Donovan and I lost touch after a bit, and never went back to the woods again. I'm not sure what we ran into in those woods, but I never want to meet it again. When I was a boy of just 16 years old, we lived way back up in a hollow, in a farmhouse about a mile back into the woods, up a steep gravel road. It was the only house in that hollow. One night it was winter. My dad woke me up in the wee hours of the night, handed me a 12-gauge single shotgun, 3 double-aught buckshot shells, and a flashlight, and told me to go out and shoot whatever varmint was spooking the pigs. So I got up and quickly pulled on my clothes and boots, and went out the back door. I made it as far as the back porch, then froze in my tracks when I saw what was after the pigs. I shined my light onto something right out of a werewolf movie. It was bent over the rails of the pig pen, grabbing at the pigs as they ran back and forth and squealed. When it saw me, it stood up and bared its teeth and growled at me. It was at least 7 foot tall, maybe even taller. It had the upper body of a professional bodybuilder. It was covered in black hair and had a head like a huge German police dog. I will never forget those pointy ears and snarling snouts. I raised the shotgun, holding the flashlight against the barrel, and shot it right in the center of his chest. I was about 40 feet away from it and saw the hair part on its chest with a buckshot hit. The buckshot didn't seem to affect this thing much at all. My sister came out behind me to see what was going on. She had turned on the porch light on her way out. She gasped when she saw the thing. She said, "Gemma, what is it?" In a shaky voice, I said, "I don't know. Go back in the house." I broke the shotgun down, ejecting the spent shell, and dropped another one in the barrel. Click to shut, the beast went down and snatched up a pig with one hand, and with the other hand pushed the pig's head back, and I heard a loud pop. It had broken the pig's neck, killing it instantly. The pig went limp, and the beast threw it over its shoulder. Then it bared its much too long teeth, that mean crowd again, as I raised the barrel of the shotgun towards it. It turned and leapt at least 15 feet in one bounce. It ran towards the tree line. I fired at it, aiming for the center of its back. I think I hit it again, but I can't be entirely sure. Then with another impossible leap, it vanished into the trees. My dad came out and said, "What was it? A coyote?" I said, "Dad, I don't know. I just know that it was big." I don't know what it was, but it got one of our pigs. Dad said, "Didn't you hit it with your shot?" I said, "Yeah, Dad, I hit it with a shot. I think I hit it at least once, but it ran off anyway." "I don't know what it was, Dad." My dad said, "Well, unload the gun, hang it back up, and go back to bed." Gemma was visibly scared. As he told this story, he said he and his sister had talked about it at the bus stop the next day. They decided to keep what had happened to themselves as they figured no one would believe them anyway. He told us that we were the first ones he had ever told about the encounter. He swore that every word of it was true. And I don't know if this thing Gemma saw is real or not, but I do believe that I saw something and shot it. I think it may have been a Bigfoot that threw those small trees and made that god-awful screaming that we heard. I think Gemma may have seen a dogman. When I wrote of my encounter to the BFRO, they called and asked permission, and then sent 2 field investigators to my house within a week of getting the report. They didn't seem to care about anything. They wanted to go back to the spot where we had camped. I took them close and pointed them in the direction, but we would not go any closer than a few miles of that spot. Also, before I end the story, I do need to mention that there was a military presence seen by many who lived up there that year, both on the ground and in helicopters. But anyway, these accounts are entirely true. Thank you for your work and keep up the fine narrations. This took place a few years ago with my best friend. We decided to go camping in Flagstaff, a place called Locket Meta. We took in our dogs, and after a day of hiking and exploration, we played around a fire and eventually went to sleep. I woke up in the middle of the night to find this deep figure outside our tent, burying itself into our tent. It had a weird way of hovering back and forth over my body and my dog, who had curled up awake and was not moving or making a sound at the bottom of my feet. I looked over and saw my best friend passing out and his dog, which I'm sure if it was awake, but clearly, I'm the only one between my friend and I'm expecting this terrifying encounter. I eventually covered my head and thought about anything to make me fall asleep. The next day, I asked my friend if he had somehow been awake throughout it all, and he said no and thought I was lying. I told him maybe it was a bear, so we looked around our campsite and couldn't find anything. No trails, no prints, nothing. We also had our food out on a table near our tents, and a trash bag hung up on a broken branch. So even if it was a bear, I'm surprised it didn't get any of our stuff. Either way, I remember how scared I was seeing this dark, weird object observing our tent. It could have been the wind, a deer, or a bear. Who knows? That this is just one encounter of the whole camping trip. The next night, we decided to camp at Beaver Creek. Mind you, we're in Arizona if you wish to know. However, before we were settled in, we explored Sedona, and we drove to Oak Creek and parked our car near a trail down to the water. We took our dogs and hiked the creek. After we finished jumping in and swimming and drying off, we were about to head out, and the next thing you know, we see from the corner of our eye a big rock being thrown near us, making a big splash in the water. We look up and can't see anything, so we run over the stones to get a clear view and see no one. We yell out foul words and hear no one running off or anything. When we got to our next campsite at Beaver Creek and set up, my friend told me throughout the trip since we started in Flagstaff, he'd had rocks being thrown at him up until that large rock at Oak Creek. We looked at each other and thought maybe someone was following and messing with us. We sort of laughed it off and said that it was impossible, and that we were going to try and connect the dots. Well, I'm glad nothing else happened, and the next day we packed up and went home with nothing but a memory to be justified. My grandfather told me a story about how he saw one of these cryptids face to face once. I never had heard such a thing until long after he died. I was drinking with some friends and we were swapping creepy stories. My friend, who's native, then told me it was actually a legend amongst the tribes that she grew up around. My grandfather is Hispanic, we're Hispanic, but not of any direct native descent, and to my knowledge he didn't have any native friends. So thinking back on the story he told me, I now think he was being truthful. This is what I remember. My grandfather used to be a grunt out in the oil fields, which means he basically does maintenance on the rigs and odd jobs. Well, his shift was overnight, and he said that it was already very lonely and eerie out there on a normal night out in the hills in pitch darkness. The sound of the rigs were super dissonant sounding. He said sometimes it sounded like babies crying. Other times it sounded like someone was whispering his name. Just really creepy stuff. So one night he gets out of his truck and climbs up onto a rig like normal when he stops because he's face to face with this thing. He said it resembled a bird, but it was a humanoid creature. It stood super tall, much taller than he was. Its whole body was covered in black feathers, and they were like square patterns. Its face was long and pointed, but it wasn't exactly a beak like it was just part of its face. It was not hard like that of a beak of a bird. Its eyes were bright red with massive pupils, and it just stood there staring at him. He said he was frozen, and so was it. They both just stood there staring at each other. He said it felt like the thing was just as surprised by his presence as he was of it. And as he was trying to, just get out of that situation, he caught it off guard, and it was still standing there rigid with its arms. He couldn't tell if they were arms or wings, pressed firmly against its eye. After a few minutes, Grandpa regained control of his legs again and started to walk back down the rig's ladder as slowly as possible. The thing seemingly stayed put, didn't move a muscle, and didn't blink. He said as soon as he touched the ground, he booked it back to his truck and got the heck out of there. The story always freaks me out. Like any other Latin grandpa, mine had countless stories about creatures and ghosts and stuff. But this one, I feel like this one was too weird to be made up. Years later, my friend basically confirmed that this thing is real. This happened around August of last year. I'm not sure what we experienced, but whatever it was, it terrified us. So, this was a hike up to Halftone. We had a campground around 20 minutes drive away from the trailhead, and the group was composed of 18-year-old me, my uncle, 32-year-old male, and my uncle's friend Dee. There were 2 girls with us, but they aren't relevant to the story. My uncle and his friend are both Christians, so there were no substances consumed that could be used to induce feelings. We get to our campsite, set up the camp, and go to sleep after reading. We were planning to wake up at 4 to start our hike by 4:30. I randomly woke up at 3:30, completely wide awake, and looked out my hammock. I remember feeling this odd feeling as if I were woken up by something, and remember looking out at this moonlit scene and thinking to myself, it's just like a dream. I lay back in the hammock but couldn't go to sleep and ended up waking up my uncle and friend around 3:50. My uncle asks, "Why are you walking around at night?" And I say, "I'm not doing that." He says he woke me up for some reason and could hear someone walking around, not like an animal, but a person. I say that it's quite weird and try to brush it off. We get to the trailhead around 4:30, and it seems everyone is unloading from their car. Dee says he needs to use the restroom, which there are a couple of before the trailhead. I walked behind him and saw the car falling behind me and waiting for my uncle who had forgotten something in his own car. The short straight road from the little parking lot runs directly into a T-section with the road of the trailhead and the bathroom, which runs directly across from the intersection throughout the little field. Those who have been there know what I'm talking about. We get to the intersection and wait for Dee to escape the bathroom. We wait 10 minutes before going in to check, and he's not there. I go back to my uncle and tell him that's weird. Maybe he went back to the car to get something he's missed. By 5:10, we're starting to worry. My uncle goes to check the car while I waited at the intersection to make sure we didn't miss him, and he went down the road from the trailhead. My uncle says he isn't there either. We decided maybe he went up to the trailhead without us for some reason and walked up 10 minutes, and he wasn't there either. We're kind of baffled now because there are no other logical explanations to us for where he could have G. We waited at the intersection for over half an hour and checked at the car, bathroom, and trailhead, and you weren't there, he says. I went to the bathroom. He then asks me where my uncle is, and I say he was at the trailhead, and he asks me again. Note that it's weird as he's asked me twice, and as we're crossing the bridge to the trailhead, he sees a light off in the riverbank, and exclaims that yes, that must be him, and I just look at him and keep walking. I thought his behavior was very strange, like he wasn't thinking straight. We finally get to the hike, and it goes by as normal except that we seem to keep losing things such as my uncle's small red flashlight, one of the girl's gloves, a water bottle, etc. And it was just like we'd simply forgotten about them and couldn't remember where we'd left them. On the way back, it got dark, and we turned on our flashlights, and as we neared the end of the hike after the 2 waterfalls, it began to seem as if we'd been walking for too long. My uncle also confirms this, asking me, "Doesn't it seem like it's taking way longer to get back?" I said, "Yeah." And I was just thinking that we kept walking, but it still seems we aren't making any progress. I've been on that trail many times, and as I was walking, I couldn't help but spot how weird those events felt. After we got home, my aunt asked my uncle if we were camping, and he says, "How'd you know?" As we didn't tell them that we were going since it was a very last-minute decision. She says that she had an odd dream where she sees my uncle in a tent of a forest, and someone is outside of his tent. She said she couldn't see who it was but knew there was a presence there. She said she woke up around 3 and had the strong urge to pray for him, and it worked. I don't know what you make of all of this, but I really would like your opinions. In Roscommon County, Michigan, a few years back, I had what I believe to be a wendigo, or possibly a dogman encounter. I was biking down an old, quiet 2-track near my home, scoping out 100 acres of land that had lowered immensely in price. It was 1 o'clock in the afternoon when I caught sight of a figure about 10 to 12 feet tall, taking roughly 3 steps about 50 yards ahead of me across the property line. I quickly stopped my bike, gazing ahead for a better look. The figure had backward hind legs, its neck was strange, and its eye was a distinct yellow. The neck was so long it looked as though the thing could swallow an entire human in it. When it walked, there was no up or down movements, but more of a gliding. This figure seemed spiritual, not physical, and it soon disappeared. I went to check for tracks, but I seemingly found none. The land eventually sold, and when it did, I was back to check out an RV someone was selling. The land the RV was on was the same land I'd witnessed the creature 6 months prior. Seeing this made all the memories of the creature flood back to me. I wanted to ask the elderly owners if they'd noticed anything strange while out here, but I also thought that might be bizarre. I was there on business, so I had to be careful in my wording. Knocking on the couple's door, they opened up. I told them I knew the land well, and was curious if they'd seen any wolves or wildlife around the area. The couple smiled and went on a heavy rebuke of wolves. I then changed the subject and went inside the RV to find walls covered in wallpapers of wolves, pictures of wolves everywhere. There were also many references to Indians and dream catchers. I never did buy the RV, but I believe what I saw 6 months prior was a dogman or maybe a wendigo. My story takes place 6 years ago when 15 years old. I wanted to go hunting out on our property, which is about 370 acres in total. It took some convincing, but my old man finally agreed that I could go hunting on my own. When it was time to go, I was absolutely excited. I grabbed my molly bag and crossbow before jumping onto the dirt biking, setting off on my hunt. It was about 8 o'clock in the morning when I got to my grandpa's property and saw all the no trespassing signs. I ignored these and sprayed Dopey on all of my stuff to make sure nothing would smell me. I rushed off to my favorite tree stand. I'm on my way up to my tripod when suddenly I hear a loud thump. A tree fell, but I thought it was going Sedona at the time. I continued my climb. Another tree soon falls, and I stopped. I'm actually worried at this point and looking into the distance. Suddenly there was a high-pitched scream in the distance. I couldn't describe it too well as I'm pretty much deaf and have an implant in my ear that helps me hear. It was when I was almost at the top, I see a monster buck running for its life. I quickly slide down and grab my crossbow. When I suddenly see this huge dog-like figure staring me in the eyes. It's now standing on its back legs. I was too afraid to move when my great-grandfather shows up on an ATV and yells at me to get on. I hop on Andy, and I leave. Later on, my hunting pal, I'll keep his name private, mentioned to me a story about a black dog-like figure that would prowl the woods. I believe it was the Dog Man. If you ever encounter one, run and don't look back.